common. We both trained in ethology, the biological study of animal behaviour by Nico Tinbergen at Oxford. You perhaps 10 years ahead of me. How do you think ethology has changed since our student days?
Well, you obviously speak of those times with affection, and so do I. It was a wonderful introduction to behaviour and research. Nico there with a gang of students, and we were a very tight-knit kind of group, and he was like a great sort of uncle for us. I think the thing that's changed most is the emphasis there was then on animals cooperating in their lives, that okay, you'd have conflict between two males, but they would resolve this conflict, and then they would court females, and the male and the female were synchronized in their behavior and so on. Now we realize how much more subtle animal communication, animal behavior is, and I think there have been some wonderful advances. Perhaps one of the first places where we really extended the old idea of why animals were doing anything from time to time, I think Mike Cullen was very influential with optimum foraging theory, and the fact that, you know, as you watch a bird foraging in a field, it's not just appetitive behaviour can somewhat react as we used to think of, but the bird assessing how long since I last had a food item. Was it a good food item? How much energy will I expend to fly a quarter of a mile to the next place, and so on.
Yeah.
Of course, not consciously thinking this, but
yes.
Those kind of capabilities are built in.
I think Mike was enormously influential in all sorts of ways, and a kind of unsung hero, really.
Yes.
I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you, I'm feeling slightly sort of disloyal and heretical here, but one of the things I feel about the work, not just of Nico, but of really everybody in that world, was that what we were finding out was not really so much truths about the animals that would stand for all time, but elegant illustrations to put in textbooks. So things like the stickleback fights red dummies, or herring gull chicks will peck at a long pencil with stripes on and things. Those are beautiful illustrations of some principle, and they go into textbooks as an illustration. But you wouldn't actually say that's like Watson and Crick getting the shape of the double helix. I don't mean in importance, but this is a fact about herring gulls. It's not so much a fact about herring gulls. It's almost a neat thing to put in a textbook to illustrate, and you've written the leading ethology textbook of our time, so you know that. I mean, but would you agree that there was something of that in the sort of research that was going on?
Well, yes, and but there is, I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of the principle there, that I think the principle of sign stimuli was quite an important one generally, and remains so, that the animal is not sort of, is picking out certain key, and natural selection has found important aspects of the environment, and
ignoring the rest.
And ignoring the rest. That you go for this. And of course you can take the principle too far, but I think it was quite valuable as a way of indicating how the behaviour is organised.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that's what I'm saying. It's just that it wasn't so much a finding about sticklebacks. It was a tentative and probably true generalisation about animals generally.
Yes.
And whether it, I mean, nobody actually looked to see whether it had to be red. I mean, blue might have done just as well.
Well, and of course, you know, one thinks of Hans Krook's very good and very honest and frank biography of Nico, in which he points out that a lot of the early experiments were pretty flawed, actually. I mean,
statistically, certainly.
Well, of course, I always remember Nico said, I don't bother with it. If you do enough experiments, you don't need statistics.
Yes, no.
If you look at some of the data in some of his early experiments of Philanthus orientating to its nest, you know, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, one case it's 66 reactions to 0, and the other case it's 0 reactions to 85, and so on.
Philanthus, the digger wasp.
The digger wasp. That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but wouldn't you agree that what's really the real influence of Lawrence and Tinbergen was that they got going on an approach to animal behaviour which really extended. The animal, think of the environment into which it's evolved. Think of the forces which have been acting on it in the in evolutionary past and what are acting on it at the moment, and that's the way you go. And this was such a breath of fresh air.
It was a breath of fresh air.
After the American experimental psychology.
Yes, but the other thing about Nico especially, I think, more than Lawrence, was that he thought of it in mechanistic terms. He thought of the animal in its wild state, with natural selection bearing down upon it, and in evolution. Nevertheless, there was a clockwork in there. There was a mechanism in there, and you understood it in mechanistic terms rather than in subjective terms. And that was a very important part of Nico, I think.
Certainly was, and it makes me think what he would feel about this new and quite growing area of research which calls itself cognitive ethology, in which a lot of speculation is made about what is going on inside animals' heads. And I remember Nico being very dismissive of any attempt to look at the finer subtleties of what's going on in the animal. We can't... Something like since we have no means of knowing what's going on inside the animal's mind, it is quite valueless or to speculate about it. Well, I don't know about you, but personally, I feel I do want to speculate about that, and I think not in any extreme way. I mean, Morgan's canon, you shan't explain anything in a complex way if a simpler way will do, remains, I think, something we should... I mean, one of the great contributions that behavioural science can make. Nevertheless, I think sometimes in the past we've tended to underestimate what animals can do.
Yes, I agree about that. I think that one of the slight dangers of cognitive ethology is that it makes respectable the kind of person who says, well, you do science, I mean, I know what my dog's thinking. And there is a lot of that, and it actually can kind of creep into a sort of anti-scientific feeling. And in a way, you could say, well, any fool knows what their dog's thinking, in a way. And if science were as easy as that, we wouldn't need to do all sorts of things that we do. And so it was an extremely valuable thing that Nico and the other early ethologists did, was to say, no, we actually have got to think mechanistically. Not that we don't believe that animals have a subjective consciousness, but that's not the way to proceed and get anywhere in science.
I think that's absolutely right. It was a very necessary, what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't shock, because that suggests that we were, all of us, thinking in the way old Lloyd Morgan did, that beavers can understand hydrology when they build their dams and all that. But it was a necessary antidote to that. I do agree. I mean, Nico, but the mechanisms are essential. But sometimes I'm reminded of old Stephen Walker's book, I think, A Man Who Began as a Skinnerian, Skinner boxes and all that, saying sometimes explanations can be too simple to be sensible. And
yes,
I do feel that in a way. Oh, we are joined by an animal. Whether you wish him to stay or not, there he is. He'll settle down probably. No, I think that's completely right. But I'm struck by how careful modern workers are. People like Irene Pepperberg, working with this extraordinary parrot, that's now dead, but others, to be careful that they're not giving unconscious clues, as, the famous case of Clever Hans, the horse, where the horse was not looking at the blackboard, it was looking at just the owner's chin, which went up by 2 millimetres. Clever Hans was clever, wasn't he?
Yes, but not quite that way. Yes.
No, not the way one thinks. But I think where Nico, I think, might be a little happier about cognitive ethology is that it relies on the old ethological skills of careful observation. Don't deduce more than you can see, but try and set the thing up to give the animal the maximum chance.
Yes.